My name is Ben Norton. I'm an American journalist, but I'm based in Nicaragua, and I'm an investigative journalist, and I'm the assistant editor of the journalism website, The Grayzone. The Grayzone is a small group. There are four of us. You can kind of even say a collective of journalists, and we are all investigative journalists and anti-imperialists. And the bulk of our work is dedicated to investigating really the crimes of the empire, right? So whether that's through regime change operations, direct military intervention, or these days hybrid warfare. And that's something we focused more and more on in our reporting, is how hybrid warfare has evolved in the 21st century, largely involving economic warfare through sanctions and other means, cyber warfare, information warfare, and other forms of what people call non-conventional warfare. And at the Grayzone, we focus a lot on that, looking at the revolving doors between the US government, the British government, other imperialist governments, and large corporations, so-called human rights organizations, opposition groups in countries targeted by regime change. So in countries like here in Nicaragua and Venezuela, Russia, China, Iran. And at the end of the day, we are all American journalists. So the bulk of our reporting focuses on what the largest empire in the world is doing, the US empire, especially in this time right now under Trump. It's, really skyrocketed. The economic warfare, the sanctions, the CIA operations, the regime change strategies to try to overthrow the government in Venezuela, the government in Iran, and the government here in Nicaragua. So I work with Max Blumenthal, another investigative journalist who is the founder and the editor-in-chief of the Grayzone, and I'm the assistant editor, and I also report, I write, and I do video work and make films and short videos. And all of our work together, we see it as part of a larger global movement. We are, of course, journalists. I wouldn't really say I'm an activist in the sense I'm not an organizer, but I see our work as part of a larger global movement fighting against injustice in general, but specifically against imperialism, war, and exploitation. And we recognize that imperialism is the most unjust, most brutal, bloodiest form of exploitation going on in the world. My personal view is I think that you cannot be a socialist without being an anti-imperialist first and foremost, because imperialism in the past at least 100, but actually more, really the past 200 and even you could argue 400 years, imperialism has been kind of the main form through which capital operates, especially in this globalized world. It doesn't make sense to be a socialist and not be an anti-imperialist, because in order to challenge capital, in order to challenge the dictatorship of capital and this exploitative capitalist system, you have to understand how it operates internationally at the international stage through monopoly capital, through states, through military force, through the use of financial instruments like the IMF and the World Bank. This entire system is held together by imperialism. Imperialism is the current highest stage of capitalism. So I am also a socialist, and I'm a journalist, and of course those are not in any way contradictory. Most journalists claim to be, bourgeois mainstream journalists claim to be objective and neutral. What that really means is that they're actually just capitalists, often liberal capitalists or maybe more right-wing capitalists and imperialists. But that ideology, because it's the hegemonic ideology enforced by the state, by culture, by mainstream corporate media, that ideology is invisibilized and it's portrayed as neutrality, when in reality, I'm pretty open about the fact that I have an ideology, but most mainstream corporate journalists are not open. And in that sense, they're actually propagandists, because they claim as though they're being more honest by supposedly being neutral, but they're actually being dishonest by not openly grappling with their own ideological biases and how they reinforce existing power structures. And there's no question whatsoever that the British media, like the US media, is absolutely biased in the interest not only really of the billionaire capitalists that own the media. Of course, that's obvious. It's easy to point that out. The corporate sponsors, the advertisers. Of course, it's biased in their interests, but it's also in many ways part and parcel of the state. And corporate media outlets almost never challenge the state, especially in matters of so-called national security. We definitely see that not only in the US, but really in the British media, where there actually is a system by which the Department of Defense directly censors media reporting, and they have a board with called the D-Notice Committee with numerous leaders of the corporate media and publishing houses, really all of the most prominent media arms. And there are numerous members of these professional media organizations who sit on the D-Notice board, and they work with the Department of Defense in the UK, the Ministry of Defense, to make sure that so-called national security is not challenged by their reporting. Let me repeat that. They're working directly with the Ministry of Defense to censor journalism on behalf of national security, which is whatever the Ministry of Defense says. Anything that challenges national security is anything that they don't want to be published. So, you know, this is pretty well documented. They even have a website. Just look up D-Notices. And we saw that so clearly with the crucifixion, really, of Jeremy Corbyn and everyone around him. So many people, Jackie Walker, Chris Williamson, there were so many lies and smears that began with British intelligence services and military circles that were laundered through the corporate media, treated as unquestionable truth, and then used to tarnish the reputation of these leftist leaders and eventually get them purged from labor, or in the case of Corbyn, swing the election on behalf of right-wing Tories. It's the exact same thing that happens in the US with Russiagate, now with all this anti-China propaganda, and to a lesser degree, we saw a similar campaign aimed at destroying Bernie Sanders and his movement. So we really should understand that this phenomenon in the US with manufacturing consent, as Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky famously wrote, that definitely is a feature of the American media, and the US media is especially propagandistic, but The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Torygraph, the British media isn't really much better. And while they may pretend to be more independent, at the end of the day, they're still working with the British national security state. The leaked internal reports from the Labour Party, I wish I could say that they're surprising. Unfortunately, they're not. They're confirming what many of us have been saying for years. There was a concerted campaign. You could even say a conspiracy. Of course, I don't like that term because it's so smeared, but conspiracies exist, and this is what a conspiracy looks like. Leaders of the Labour Party, the right wing of the Labour Party, the Blairites that still control the party apparatus, were actively conspiring to destroy the campaign of Jeremy Corbyn. Period. End of story. There's no disputing that. That is not my opinion. That is what any objective, sober analysis of these documents would entail. If you have reading comprehension skills above middle school, if you have high school level reading comprehension skills, and you see these internal documents, it's clear that the right wing of the party apparatus that controls the party, the Blairites, actively stabbed Jeremy Corbyn in the back and swung the election to get the Tories elected. They would rather at first have had Theresa May win, and in 2017 it was a very close election. And if it weren't for them, actually, Labour would probably be in power right now. But they would rather, at that point, they would rather have Theresa May win and the Tories in power. And then even in the most recent election, last year in 2019, once again, we saw that they sabotaged Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party as a whole. The Labour Party had a historic loss. They lost numerous seats in the north. I mean, the red wall was completely destroyed. And why was it destroyed? Because the neoliberal Blairites would rather have the Tories stay in office under Boris Johnson than lose the control of their party, because they recognize that if Jeremy Corbyn and the socialist wing, the actual left, controlled Labour, they would never come back. Because if there was an actual leftist Labour Party, they lose all of their consultants who have lucrative contracts, basically sinecures doing nothing and working with corporate clients. And the actual base of the party itself was clearly very mobilized, energized by the leftist program that Corbynism represented. So the Blairites can't actually present popular policies that people want. The only way they can get elected is with the boogeyman of the Blairites, or the boogeyman of the Tories, rather, with the boogeyman of the conservatives. So they say the only way to get the conservatives out of office is to elect us. Now, we're not going to give you anything you want. We're still going to help we're going to move to the privatization of the NHS. We're still going to impose austerity, but at least we're not the Tories. So it's the same thing that the neoliberal Democrats have done, just as they sabotaged Bernie Sanders' campaign, because it's all about making sure that the corporate elites that control all of these political parties continue staying in control. And if one of these mainstream parties gets out of control and is actually under the control of socialists, then it could actually lead to real economic democracy. But instead, they want to maintain the illusion of political democracy, which neither the US nor Britain really has, and continue with the farce of these two parties that aren't really that different, and at the end of the day, both represent the billionaires that run the country.
Yeah.
Well, the attempt to now go after the leakers is what all of these institutions do. When someone exposes the crimes inside an institution like the Labor Party, like the CIA or MI6 or any of these hegemonic state institutions or capitalist institutions, the response is never, oh, we're going to deal with the problem, we're going to change, we're going to reform. No, the response is, who is the leaker? We need their heads on a silver platter. And that's exactly what's going to happen in labor now. The right wing that is back in control, the Blairites that are back in control, they are going to purge with authoritarian measures anyone that challenges their program. And this is the ultimate irony, is that the same corporate media outlets and even the same members of labor, some of whom may have been well-intentioned, many not well-intentioned, who falsely, absurdly claimed that Corbynism was authoritarian in some way, or that socialists are authoritarian. The irony is the Blairites, the neoliberals, are showing they're the authoritarian ones because they understand the only way they can hold on to power is by subverting democracy, because their program is not a democratic program. Their program does not represent the interests of working class people. Their program represents the interests of the bondholders, the shareholders, simply the capitalists, the rich elites who fund their party, who fund their campaigns, and who control the economy. So now is when they double down, go after the leakers, and then in a year, they hope that everyone forgot about the fact that they completely just rigged the election against their own Labor Party leader. I mean, it's so similar to what happened with Bernie Sanders. We all know, thanks to WikiLeaks, and by the way, let's never forget that WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange is rotting right now in Belmarsh prison in the UK. And because he published information that exposed the crimes of these parties, of these governments. But WikiLeaks showed in 2016 that the DNC was working actively against Bernie Sanders on behalf of Hillary Clinton, and that they intentionally elevated Donald Trump because they assumed that Hillary Clinton could easily beat Donald Trump in what they called the Pied Piper strategy. We all know this, and it's basically identical to what the Labor Party did a year later in 2017 against Jeremy Corbyn, where they would rather have had the Tories win, Theresa May win, than have a socialist win. And it just goes to show that these parties, unfortunately, the apparatus of the party, they don't act on behalf of the voters. They act on behalf of the people who own the parties, who are capitalists. That they're capitalist parties. And I mean, Labor has a different history. It does have a history of more socialistic policies, unlike the Democratic Party. But unfortunately, since the rise of the Third Way and Blairism, it's been very clear who they represent, and they represent the same people that the Tories represent.
Yeah.
The Bernie Sanders movement, I think, opened up a lot of political space on the left in the U.S., and in that sense, it's really welcome. I mean, not just in my lifetime, which is relatively short compared to, modern history, but really ever in the history of U.S. politics, maybe since you could say Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s, the U.S. has never had in the Democratic Party a major presidential candidate pushing for a progressive program. Now, Bernie Sanders called himself a democratic socialist. In Europe, that might be seen as kind of funny because in Europe, what the program he was calling for is actually the program of many right-wing parties in Europe, because the US is such a far-right country where even basic social democratic policies like free public education, like universal health care, those are policies that are taken for granted in Europe and much of the world. But in the US, it is such a right-wing, ultra-capitalist country that those policies are seen as radical. The fact that a candidate calling for that program could be such a popular candidate, the most popular politician really in the US, according to some polls, that is really welcoming. And the fact that he used the word socialism, although of course he qualified it with democratic socialism, which is throwing red meat to the cold warriors, but notwithstanding that fact, that is pretty impressive, and that's important in opening space on the actual left in the US. At the same time, Bernie Sanders, as I was just acknowledging, he's not really that left wing. His program and his politics are really just milk a toast European style social democracy. That's welcome in the US, and I hope that he could win, but unfortunately he didn't. And now the question is, why didn't he? First of all, I think the most obvious answer is everything was rigged against him. The DNC as a party apparatus, we know, was absolutely rigged against him. The primary itself was rigged against him from the very beginning, where in Iowa, it was basically just stolen from him. And there are so many strange circumstances I don't have time to get into, but I'll just say that the app that was used to count the votes in this arcane, ridiculous anti-democratic system called a caucus, which is it's not the candidate with the most vote wins. It's an arcane system. But the app used to count the votes didn't work. There were all these errors. And the people who created the app was a company that was run out of a shady nonprofit that was funded by a billionaire who also funded Pete Buttigieg, the neoliberal right-wing Democratic presidential candidate. And members of the Buttigieg campaign worked at that company and that nonprofit, along with former Obama and Hillary Clinton staff. So it's very clear just from there that not only was it rigged in a kind of media sense, with the media constantly attacking Bernie, not was it only rigged in the sense that the DNC apparatchiks were working against Bernie, but literally in the sense of the actual voting system used to count the votes was rigged against Bernie. And of course, in numerous other states, there were massive irregularities, massive, exponentially worse than the supposed irregularities in Bolivia, which were used by the U.S. to justify a military coup to install a fascist regime, overthrowing the democratically elected government last November. So according to the U.S.'s own standards, they were rigged beyond belief inside the Democratic primary. And then finally, I have to mention that the exit polls were 10, 12, 15% off, way above and beyond the expected margin of error. So we have to acknowledge that it was absolutely rigged. No one with a straight face can dispute that fact. At the same time, Bernie Sanders also, I think, made a lot of mistakes. And it should be acknowledged that Bernie Sanders was very weak on the Democratic Party, even as it was stabbing him in the back, much in the same way that Jeremy Corbyn really refused to speak out against the Blairites, who were smearing him as an anti-Semite without any evidence in this blatantly false smear campaign. We now know that half of these so-called anti-Semitism accusations inside Labour came from one person. It was clearly a concerted campaign to destroy Corbyn, and Corbyn never really challenged it face-on in the same way that Bernie never challenged it face-on. In fact, in the case of Bernie, he said from day one, I'm going to endorse the Democratic Party candidate, which is a sign that he was never going to challenge the party apparatus as a whole, because he always was willing to endorse the candidate if it wasn't him. And of course, he did endorse Joe Biden, who's a right-wing war criminal who supported every war since his time in the Senate in the U.S., who's also been accused by 8 women of sexual assault, and who, frankly, we just have to acknowledge, is totally demented. His mental health is very, very poor. He can barely give a speech without incomprehensible sentences. And Bernie endorsed him, which is a massive betrayal to his mass movement. So I think that it's a sign of weakness on Bernie's part. I think in many ways his movement was very welcome, and his movement as a movement will live beyond him. But as a campaign, he never challenged the corporate media as it attacked him constantly. He never challenged the Democratic Party as it was stabbing him in the back. And at the end, he just capitulated and he gave in instead of fighting.
But
Unfortunately, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I'm not one of the super optimistic, I would say kind of blindly optimistic leftists who argues that Bernie has changed everything, the entire political spectrum has shifted. Unfortunately, we've seen a long history of the Democratic Party cannibalizing these progressive social movements, pretending as though it's going to adopt its policies and then doing nothing of the sort. Barack Obama is a case study of that. Example number one. I mean, Obama rode into office in 2008 on this ostensibly progressive platform, basically promising universal health care. I mean, he promised universal health care. He didn't promise socialized medicine, but he promised universal health care, which he absolutely did not deliver on. Instead, he just took a Republican health insurance scheme called Romney Care, named after the Republican Mitt Romney, and then just really renamed it the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare as it's popularly known, which was, he worked hand in glove with the insurance industry. It was a complete disaster, forcing people to buy private health insurance with no measures to keep the price of health insurance down. So the prices skyrocketed, a total scheme. And Obama, many people thought he would be a progressive, that he would change things. All he did was actually continue the neoliberal policies on steroids, bailing out Wall Street and the banks with trillions of dollars, not just billions. And at the end of the day, it was trillions of dollars of tax dollars, of public money that went into the from public coffers that went into the private pockets of capitalists. And at the end of the day, Barack Obama has not only refused to apologize, he's doubled down. Since leaving office, Barack Obama has been doing $400,000 paid speeches for each speech on Wall Street, telling bankers what they want to hear for $400,000. And he even gave a very lucrative speech. We don't know the exact number, but six-figure speech for a bunch of rich bankers while sitting next to a former Bush and Reagan official. And I reported on this for the Grayzone. And in this private event, although we obtained a video of it, Obama bragged. He told people on Wall Street, you all complained that I was anti-business. Look where your stocks were when I entered, and look where they were when I left. And just say thank you, please. Just say thank you, please, is what Obama told Wall Street. So Biden isn't even pretending to be a progressive. Obama pretended to be a progressive. So yes, it's true that Bernie Sanders moved the political spectrum and the imagination of average working Americans to the left. And that's good because then they can try to hold these institutions to account. But the Democratic Party itself has no reason to move to the left. In fact, they have every reason to move to the right because their strategy, which is the strategy of their corporate donors, is to try to appeal to the fictional moderate conservative, as though they can win over these more moderate members of the Republican Party who are just going to vote for the Republican no matter who the candidate is. This was a strategy that Hillary Clinton tried. It's triangulation. We're going to keep moving to the right to win over the fictional moderate conservative. Why? Because they know that there is no large mass movement that has a third party behind it that can challenge the Democratic Party. They know that anyone on the left, they have two choices, really, at the end of the day, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, and they're not going to support the Republican Party. So they have no incentive to the left in any way. So at the end of the day, I think that Bernie played a positive role in shifting the spectrum at the grassroots level and increasing people's standards. And that's where people are going to have to push the Democratic Party. But the Democratic Party is by no means going to do it on its own. And even if Joe Biden wins office, which unfortunately I do not think is likely, I think Trump just won re-election, and that the neoliberal Democrats who control the DNC would rather Trump win re-election than have Bernie be president. But if in some kind of miracle Joe Biden becomes the president, I think it's very clear that he will run significantly to the right even of Obama, who was a center-right president. And only at the grassroots level are we ever going to be able to hold the government to account and push these institutions to when it has no other alternatives but to meet our demands. Well, I think it's certainly possible that at the end, the DNC might just anoint another candidate without any pretense of a democratic election. I mean, they've made it pretty clear already that they don't care about democracy at all. They've sabotaged so many levels of ostensible democracy. I mean, the degree to which democracy really existed in the first place in the U.S. is highly questionable. I mean, numerous study after study shows that somewhere around 97% of people running in Senate races and somewhere around 93% of people running in House of Representatives races, 97%, 93% of the candidates with more money wins. So it's quite clear that that's not a democracy by any stretch of the imagination. And even some academics published a study, academics out of Princeton University published a study doing a quantitative analysis looking at the impact of grassroots movements on policy by the government, and they found that average people and grassroots movements have a round down to a 0% impact. Not even negligible, no impact, no measurable impact on how policy is made in the U.S. And they concluded in a very, austere, scholarly way that there is no democracy in the United States. And that was even before this farce of where they just rigged everything against Bernie. So it's clear that the Democratic Party and the system itself does not really care about democracy, and I think it's possible. The question is, who would it be? Now, what's also clear is even if Biden were the candidate and out of a stroke of luck, out of a miracle, managed to win the office, which again, I don't think is likely, Biden, I don't think, would really effectively be president. He would be the figurehead, but he wouldn't actually be making many of the decisions. His vice president, whoever that is, whether it's Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, or Michelle Obama, or Klobuchar, whoever it is, or some other figure, the vice president will probably be very influential, and the party apparatus itself, and the national security state. I think it's quite clear, as what this happens with pretty much every administration, the national security state, the intelligence services and the Pentagon, they control the foreign policy of the president. We see this even with Trump, who ran flirting on and off inconsistently with an anti-interventionist message, and he has continued regime change attempts. He is now openly saying that we're occupying sovereign Syrian territory to steal their oil. He has been trying to start a war with Iran. He's been bombing Iraq over and over again. He killed Qasem Soleimani, the second most important figure in the Iranian government, a blatant act of war. He's been expanding economic warfare and brutal, suffocating sanctions on Venezuela, which now is under blockade, on Iran, on China, on Russia, on Nicaragua. You go down the list. And I think that's largely because, one, Trump isn't actually an interventionist at heart. It was cynical sloganeering for him to win votes, but also because Trump is not really in control of his own foreign policy. It's the national security state. It's the war hawks around him. It's the Pentagon. If Biden were president, there's no way that he would in any way push back against these figures. The entire foreign policy apparatus would be in charge of itself. The CIA, the Pentagon, they would be in charge. So unfortunately, I don't see any progressive possibilities of a Biden administration, which is why I and many people on the left have been saying there is no functional difference at the end of the day between Biden and Trump. Basically, all of the same policies would stay the same. Now, Biden would be more polite. He wouldn't be as explicitly racist in his rhetoric. His rhetoric would be different to the extent to which he can actually speak. I mean, if he could give a speech that is comprehensible in English, it would be less racist and less impolite, but his policies would be equally racist and equally deadly. So unfortunately, it's incumbent upon people at the grassroots level to exercise politics ourselves as people who actually believe in real political and economic democracy. And we need to organize because the government is not going to act on behalf of our interests. We have to pressure the government to do so. You can find my reporting at thegrayzone.com, and that's with the Yankee spelling, Gray, thegrayzone.com. And you can find other reporting by my colleagues. I mean, I don't want to boast at all, but just being realistic, I think we're one of the only investigative journalism websites remaining that is, and especially one that is dedicated to exposing, the crimes of the national security state and an empire from an anti-imperialist perspective. So you can find our reporting there. Also, I have a podcast and video show with the Grayzone editor, Max Blumenthal, and that's a tongue-in-cheek name. It's called Moderate Rebels. And you can find that at moderaterebels.com. We're on YouTube, iTunes, Spotify, all the big platforms. And then, of course, you can follow me on social media. I spend a lot of time, honestly, too much time, basically half my life on social media. And you can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. And I'm on Facebook and all the other platforms. And I just want to thank you all over in the UK. Thank you for the interview, and I'd love to come back anytime. But also thanks to you all for the political work you're doing. I mean, you all are comrades in the same mutual struggle. This is an international struggle against the same contradictions, the same problems that we're all dealing with. And the more we build these international connections, I think the stronger our movement becomes and the more power we have to actually change the system.